Did your daddy hurt your widow feelings while you were growing up? Then you should read To The Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. And one question before we get to the book review. Did I enjoy this read? And the answer is surprisingly, yes. Hey guys, welcome to Whiskey and Literature. I'm your host, Captain Mike, and I'm reading and reviewing 52 books in 52 weeks in 2023. And while I'm turning these pages, I'm sipping the bottles, the finely distilled spirits. This is my 29th book review of the year so far, To The Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. And before we talk about this book, let's talk about Virginia Woolf briefly. Virginia Woolf was born in 1882, died in 1941. And tragically, she committed suicide by walking into a river with her pockets full of rocks. This was about 12 years after she wrote Mrs. Dalloway, in which one of the main characters also committed suicide rather than be taken to an institution by throwing himself into a river. And she wrote this book, To the Lighthouse, as a way to deal with her relationship with her parents. And a lot of the events, the places, and the persons in this novel are taken directly from her childhood. And in fact, I'm reading all these classic novels this year, and not just them, but a lot of books, the authors write themselves into it. And I think that's a very therapeutic way that they deal with issues from their childhood and from other aspects of their life. Okay, quick specs and stats on To the Lighthouse. It was first published in 1927. My copy has 209 pages in it. I paid $11.99 for it from Amazon. It's a fairly decent copy. It's one of the better books that I have this year that I didn't get from the Goodwill bookstore. I also listened to part of the book on Audible, which was read by Nicole Kidman for 6 hours and 37 minutes. And I listened to most of the book, to be honest, and I finished the book, most of the last part, by reading. Okay, the style of To the Lighthouse. This is a modernist novel told in a stream of consciousness narrative style, which was, if not pioneered by Virginia Woolf, certainly raised to new heights. Two of the major themes in the book are experiences and relationships. And when I say experience, not as in something that we do, but in how the things that happen to us are perceived by us and how those perceptions differ from the other individuals around us that went through the same situations. And relationships, as in we all have this natural gap between ourselves and those who are around us, and how do we bridge that gap? Okay, on to the plot of the book. And to be honest with you, the plot of the book, it's inconsequential. Doesn't really matter. It's just a vehicle that allows us to explore our different perceptions and relationships. Okay, part one is called The Window. And it's called The Window because we start at the Isle of Skye in the Ramsey's summer cottage. Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey, their 8 children, and some various house guests are spending the summer there. And through the use of an omniscient narrator, we shift points of view through all the different characters that allow us to see into their thoughts and perceptions. Mrs. Ramsey tells her son James that perhaps tomorrow we can go to the lighthouse. And Mr. Ramsey says, no, the weather's not going to be fine. And James wants to stab Mr. Ramsey. Lily Briscoe, one of the house guests, she tries to paint a painting of Mrs. Ramsey and James, and she is uncomfortable when someone looks over her shoulder at her painting. So many little things happen during this part one that I'm not going to go through them all, but this is the level of activity and experiences that I'm talking about. James wants to go to the lighthouse. Mr. Ramsey says, oh, the weather's not going to be good. He gets angry. Lily is uncomfortable with someone looking at her painting. That literally is the level of things that are occurring in part one. Part two is called Time Passes. And it's called Time Passes because that's what happens. Time passes. Things change. People die. Someone's lonely. A house falls into disrepair. Excepting for a smattering of Mrs. McNabb, we don't really get any of the characters' points of view. It reads more like a newspaper article that covers 10 years. The part 3 is called The Lighthouse. And it's called The Lighthouse because they get to the lighthouse. Or do they? And actually it doesn't even matter because books like life are made up of the journey and not the destination. Those Ramseys that are still alive and some of their house guests return to the summer cottage 10 years after part 1. Mr. Ramsey finally decides to go to the lighthouse, and James and Cam accompany him with a sailor and his son. And James and Cam, they vow to resist all tyranny. And while they sail away, Lily tries to complete her painting. Okay, so my thoughts. I mean, what I just said, that's essentially what happens in the novel. And it doesn't really matter because it's not about what happens. It's about the experience internally as it occurs. And admittedly, I was in despair when I started reading this novel. I actually listened to the first 4 chapters 3 times before continuing on with the novel. And then throughout, as I was listening to the novel, I would occasionally listen to a chapter and then listen to it again. It just helped me to get into the flow and really kind of hear those voices and what was going on. And overall, it was not until the end of the first part that I really began to get into the groove of the novel. And I think that I'm beginning to understand or appreciate this stream of consciousness narrative style. Maybe. I still feel as I read these classics that I'm standing in some fancy museum looking at a beautiful painting by one of the great artists. And I understand that I do not fully appreciate this work because I don't really understand it. But I'm trying. And as just a quick side note, not really relevant to the review, other than the fact that as I was reading To The Lighthouse, and I'm reading all these classic books already this year, I'm always amused and I find it enjoyable when I read about the books that I've already read this year. So in this one, they mention Middlemarch, and they mention how a volume of Middlemarch was lost. Now, we think of Middlemarch as just a complete novel, but when it came out in serial format, so it made sense to me that they would have lost just a part of the novel because it was coming out when it was being written. And they also mention Tolstoy and Vronsky specifically. I thought that was great because I just read Anna Karenina about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it was fantastic. And I think that the characters were so well done in To The Lighthouse. It's as if Virginia Woolf knew the family because she is actually part of the family. The exploration of each character's individual perception and experience, I thought they were great. It's the same narrative style used by William Faulkner, but it's in a totally different way. I've read 2 Faulkner books this year, and I've read 2 Virginia Woolfs. And the jarring shifts in Faulkner's style is just, I don't appreciate it. Whereas I've grown to appreciate Virginia Woolf's or more lyrical, coherent, continuous kind of thoughts. By the end of this novel, I really, really appreciated it. And I did really enjoy the end of this novel. When Lily was working on her painting, as she was finishing it, this portrait of Mrs. Ramsey, and she was thinking about Mrs. Ramsey, who's not with them this summer. And she thinks about the impact that she's had on her and processes through her emotions. It was very well done and very tender. And at the same time, James, with those in the sailboat, he is working the rudder, trying to keep the sail full of air. He's expecting a harsh word from his father at any time, every time the sail flutters or the wind falters. We don't see into Mr. Ramsey's mind. We just see how every little thing that he does when he turns a page in his book or he recites something from what he's just reading, how that impacts all those people around him. And it was very masterfully done. I do have an appreciation now for this stream of consciousness style narrative, and I will be going back to Virginia Woolf in the future. I might just reread Mrs. Dalloway or return to The Lighthouse. Have you read any Virginia Woolf novels? If so, what are your thoughts? Do you appreciate this narrative style? Have you never experienced this sort of thing? Or are there other authors that you would recommend to me to explore further into this style? Okay, so on to the star rating. And I judge all books on 5 criteria, 6 if I listen to it on Audible, and I did listen to this book on Audible. So let's go through it here. Initial response, how do I feel as soon as I finish the book? And man, I gave it a 4. I struggled initially, but it finished so strong, and I just felt so good when I did. 2, recommendation. How likely am I to recommend this book? It's a short but somewhat difficult read. Not for everyone. I'm going to give it a 3. And number 3, style. Did I enjoy the writing style? I'm still struggling to appreciate this style, but I still gave it a 3. 4, plot and structure. How engaged was I in the story? And I gave it a 4 because I enjoyed the simple plot, what there was of it. And I was interested to see, do they get to the lighthouse? 5, characters. Were they relatable, believable, and engaging? Of course, the characters were wonderful. They got a 5. And Audible. For those books I listened to on Audible, how was the presentation? And I give it a 5 because, quite frankly, I adore Nicole Kidman. And she did a fantastic job with the narration. All right, my guys, that is 24. And 24 divided by 6 is 4. So 4 stars for To The Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. I'll be honest with you, I didn't think this book would ever get that high when I started it. But very well done by Virginia Woolf, To The Lighthouse. Well deserved. All right, guys, thanks for sticking with me. If you enjoyed the video, like it, it's free. Subscribe to see more of my content. I do both book and whiskey reviews. And comment if you have any suggestions for me. And for now, I just hope you are reading something good and drinking something great. Turn to the pages, my friends, and stay thirsty. Cheers. Did your dad hurt your feelings while you were growing up? Do you have daddy issues?